This week, and not necessarily in this order, we welcome Ed Scotus, the founder of Counter Hack Challenges and KringleCon 2018, to talk about this year's challenge and what's in store. In another segment that'll happen at some point, we're going to welcome back Don Murdoch. Murdoch, thank you. Assistant Director of the Regent University Cyber Range and author of Blue Team Handbook, to talk about what's new in this edition, how it differs from the last. In the security news, how Taylor Swift used facial recognition. Well, it wasn't actually Taylor Swift that used anyway. Unlocking Android phones with a 3D printed head. Ticketmaster fails to take responsibility for some malware. And it's December of 2018, so, why don't we just patch all of our stuff already? All that and more on to this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. The average time between being hacked and realizing you've been hacked is 1 year. Can you afford to let an intruder roam your network for that long? Can your company weather the fallout when this comes to light? Black Hills Information Security can find the bad guys in your network and train you to do it yourself. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a hunt teaming engagement can help you find a persistent threat in your network. Domain Tools help security analysts turn threat data into threat intelligence. They take indicators from your network, including domains and IP addresses, and connect them with nearly every active domain on the internet. Those connections drive risk assessments, help profile attackers, guide online fraud investigations, and map cyber activity to attacker infrastructure. Fortune 1000 companies, global government agencies, and leading security solutions vendors use the Domain Tools platform as a critical ingredient in their threat investigations and proactive defenses. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/domain tools.
And welcome to the show. But first, let me welcome you. The man who bought GIFs, the gift of GitHub, for gosh right, Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Welcome, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. This is episode 586 even. It is being recorded on December 13th, 2018 in G-Unit Studios here in Rhode Island.
Woo-hoo.
Mr. Larry Pesci is at the table with me in studio.
Yes, that I am.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
I like your t-shirt.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, can't really see it on camera.
Mark was laughing at it. Do you think he got the joke?
I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
It's
Just
not.
checking.
It's not based on a movie, so he probably got it.
Oh, boy. Rest of the crew is on remotely. A couple of them, anyhow. Mr. Keith Hoodlet is here with us. Welcome, Keith.
Hey, I for one did not get the shirt for like the first, 30 or 40 seconds of sitting there looking at it. So
almost a minute. Almost a minute.
I looked at his shirt and didn't pay attention, and then later Larry's like, look at my shirt, and I too had to stare at it before I got it. Anyway, also on the lines, Mr. Joff Thayer. Joff, welcome.
G'day, Paul. It's good to see you. I looked at Larry's shirt there for a minute, and I misread that. I read it as tits. So I was like,
Wow. One track mind, Joff. One track mind.
Joff.
I think it's an Australian thing, honestly. The dirty jokes. It's just an Australian thing.
There's some good Australian things to talk about tonight, by the way. Speaking of Australian things,
yeah,
or maybe not so good, but we'll get to it when we get to it.
You are resident Australian expert, Joff. So. Yeah.
Yeah, or token individual, if you want to put it that way.
Yes. Quick announcement before we get started. The RSA Conference 2019.
Ooh.
Believe that?
I know.
RSA 2019.
It's coming soon, too.
It's the place to be for the latest in cybersecurity, data innovation, and thought leadership. March 4th through the 8th in San Francisco, of course. Will come alive with cybersecurity's brightest minds as they gather to discuss the industry's newest developments even. You can go to rsaconference.com/securityweekly-US19. That's a really long URL. rsaconference.com/securityweekly-US19. Register now using the discount code 5U9SWS19. F, D is in dog, F is in Frank, W is in weather, wrinkle,
Walrus.
Walrus, W is in and what's U? Ukulele,
Yes.
Uranus. It's
And,
five.
and W is our favorite
Five.
whiskey.
Oh, 5U9S, Sierra, Whiskey,
Sierra.
Foxtrot, Delta.
Yes.
I get that right?
Yes.
There you go. Receive
Good job.
$100 off a full conference pass. And
It's
now,
amazing. What a bargain.
what a bargain. I like how
I know, right?
Joff's Australian accent is kind of like our Rhode Island accent.
Yeah,
Like,
sometimes it is. I get a little New England mix in there. What a bargain.
just throw the R's right out the
Howdy.
window. No, wait, keep the R's for the end of words like idea.
Yeah, idea. I can have it. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, you can't get rid of them completely. You use them in other places. We're very efficient.
that's right. We
Like that.
rearrange.
That's
Yeah,
right.
rearrange.
Well, let's talk about the security news. We've got 2 interviews coming up that we're excited about. And so let's talk about Taylor Swift. I mean, why not? Who doesn't want to talk about Taylor Swift?
T-Swizzle.
T-Swizzle.
So for once, she's not writing songs about her boyfriends? I mean,
Wow.
No,
I'm
I think
confused.
she's still doing that. However, apparently people are stalking. I guess that's the price of fame. And according to Rolling Stone, there was a facial recognition camera hid inside of a kiosk playing clips of Taylor Swift from rehearsals as fans approached to watch the kiosk. As I mean, if you're a fan of Taylor Swift, why wouldn't you want to watch that? The camera would stealthily snap their photo. The images were then compared to a database of Swift's known stalkers. Obviously, there's some privacy concerns here. And the example is that Ticketmaster invested in Austin, Texas-based facial recognition startup Blink Identity, which says its technology can identify 60 people a minute walking at full speed past a sensor, meaning that digital tickets are a thing of the past pretty soon.
wow.
What do you guys think?
So I have one question on this, right? Say you happen to be a European citizen, you're in Austin, Texas for work, which because it's a technology hub. You decide to go check out this Taylor Swift concert, and you get your data, your picture taken, and you don't know it. Is that a violation of GDPR? Again, I know none of us on this are lawyers, but what do you think?
I mean, it depends if they are storing it. I'm not sure if your face is that covered in legislation like that.
I don't know. I mean, well, so if you think about it, right, they're comparing the database of faces against known stalkers, so they also have a list of people.
We were talking
And
about
now-
this. I don't believe there are many laws and regulations. However, bless you, there was an article that we covered on Hack Naked News that talked about the facial recognition technology and what some of the laws are around that, how they store the data. Someone actually emailed me too that did their thesis on facial recognition technology. There was lots of speculation about that. So, and about whether how do you relate that to the user was my question. Like, great, I can take Larry's picture, I can compare it, find other pictures of Larry, but how do I then? I mean, unless Larry's holding up a sign with all his personal information below his picture, which that would be
Right.
kind of
Well,
bad. But
my guess is that it would be really hard to enforce, especially if you're someone that goes to London, for example, which has, cameras everywhere.
Cameras, yeah.
So yeah, I imagine that there's probably some sort of exception for laws related to protective measures, whether it's police or protecting someone from bodily harm or other things like that. I imagine that there's probably some sort of legal protections around those people that are taking photos of other individual users for identity purposes.
Yep, and one might argue, at least on the taking of photographs here in the U.S., that in public you have no expectation of privacy, and you can take pictures of people at the park, type of thing, because you're in a public space and you don't necessarily have to get a photo release. And I suppose if you're going to use that, like in a magazine shoot or something, you should get a photo release. But I highly suspect that they ran this by some lawyers, and the lawyer said it was okay. But
Yeah,
Could be-
I mean,
I
then
could be
again, it was
wrong.
a startup. It was probably like, yeah, YOLO.
Yep.
Do the thing.
Do the thing with the stuff.
Prove the concept.
Well, yeah, that's probably it. And on the topic of London, hey, they're not going to have to worry about Europe for much longer anyway.
Yeah.
Brexit their way
Fair
right
enough.
out. No, I'm just kidding. There's going to be a second referendum, and they're going to be begging to go back in. Oh, anyway. Whoa. That went
There's a
sideways.
joke there somewhere. There's totally
Yeah,
a joke there somewhere.
And there's
I'm just
some
not
joke
gonna say it.
about Taylor Swift or something in there that we're missing. We missed that opportunity to quote a line from her song or something.
You know who
You know
had
what
a
really
hard
grinds my
Brexit?
gears?
Taylor Swift.
No, Lindsay Lohan.
So I was actually going to say, you know who had a hard Brexit though, and is going to have a really hard time with technology going forward is Australia.
Oh wait,
yeah.
I was gonna hold on. Sorry, Keith. I wanted to.
Jumping ahead.
Well, I wanted to go since we're talking about facial recognition technology. I thought a good segue, and I do want to talk about Australia and their backdoor laws. That someone unlocked Android phones with a 3D printed head. Speaking of facial recognition technology, I'm not sure how they created the head, whether it was just based on, was it pictures? I mean, I'm sure they didn't mold the person. He does say that he sent it somewhere and paid 300 euros, pounds, something.
300 non-American dollars.
300 non-American dollars to have this head made, which if you read the article or see the picture in the article, it looks very, very creepy.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And apparently he managed to unlock all 4 Android phones, which were duped into thinking they were looking at the real Tom, which is his name. Only the iPhone 10 was not duped, which somewhat unscientifically confirms our suspicions that iPhone's facial recognition technology is actually pretty good. And at further no surprise, Android's is not as secure. Go figure.
How do you like your new Android phone, Paul?
I like it. I like it.
So my guess is, doesn't the iPhone's version of the facial recognition have something to do with eye movement that it detects? Am I correct in understanding that? I know they do a couple of things. They do some sort of like radiant heat plus like eye movement and probably a few other things as far as I can recall.
Yeah. Yep. That was my understanding as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, Apple got it right when it comes to security for at least their facial recognition. Now, the security of the rest of their products and operating systems and platforms is, remains to be seen.
Yep.
I think, or not. I think we all have our opinions on that, but kind of interesting. The reason I like that story, I think it was pretty cool that you would go out and have a 3D printed head made of yourself. I mean, the only other person I could think of that would do something that crazy might be Ed. Oh, it's Ed Scotus. Oh my God, Ed is here. Hey, Ed,
Hey.
How's it going? We were just
how's that for timing?
talking about you.
A great segue,
How's it
right?
going?
Oh.
It's going good. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
So, Ed, have you ever considered making a 3D printed head based on yourself?
No, but I think Larry was going to 3D print my brain a few years ago.
Yes, in fact, I was actually going to use glow-in-the-dark filament to make it happen.
We got to get back to that project at some point.
I do.
I agree with this.
And so I have your MRIs from your brain under NDA, and
there was an NDA, but it was probably bad judgment on my part to send that.
it probably was because you wanted me to 3D print them. And for whatever reason, the tools that I was using to model it the MRI didn't have the resolution, which I find strange.
It was I was really messed up when they gave me the MRI. So they didn't have to do a very tight one. They were looking for brain tumors or MS, and they didn't need a tight resolution on it, they told me, because the problems were so significant. Turns out it was mercury poisoning. So thankfully it was neither of those issues. The brain is actually, if you look on the wall behind me, can you see the pictures of my brain?
Yep. Other side, Ed. Other side.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wait, you have pictures of your MRI of your brain hanging in your office?
You don't?
Oh, I'm going to get right on that, actually.
Maybe for Christmas this year, I'll send you pictures of my MRI of my brain.
There you go.
Yeah.
Oh, what a great Christmas card.
What do you have in your office? Oh, it's just Ed's brain. Well, pictures of his brain.
You see it? There it is.
Yep.
That's cool.
So it's like, this is your brain. This is Ed's brain on your wall.
There you go. I figured it might as well. Look, I was freaked out when I was going through the whole thing. And my son even, he came into my room. This was maybe 5 years ago. So he's about 12. And he said, Dad, what's going on? I'm like, well, look, there could be this issue. I got to get a brain scan. And he said, well, Dad, best case scenario that comes out of this is that, you get hundreds of pictures of your brain and you could do stuff with that. And I'm like, that's an optimist view. So.
That's not surprising for your son to say that. That doesn't shock me at all. That's something you would say, Ed.
He's a good boy. I love the studio. It looks fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we made some improvements since the last time you've been on. So yeah, I'm digging the table. It's a lot more comfortable to do the show. So your office is looking.
The lighting looks great.
Yeah, thank you. Your office is spectacular as usual.
Oh, thank you. The lights change. You'll see them every 3/4 of a second. One of the lights changes color.
Awesome.
White, green, and red for the holidays.
Ed, and you're cool talking about stories for the next 25 minutes or so, and then doing your segment. Okay, awesome.
Whatever you want to do. Should I get my Santa hat?
You can wear your Santa hat, sure, absolutely.
Okay, I'll be right back.
We're going to talk about Australian backdoors while you're doing that.
Whoa.
Is Joff here?
Yes, Joff is here. He's our resident Australian
backdoor expert.
Backdoor expert. Which is ironic because he is Australian and he is an expert in backdoors, but those two have nothing to do with each other. But so what is it? This I don't have all the details. It was hard to dig into exactly what was going on because a lot of it was basically like hyperbole about this whole story in opinions, not necessarily exactly what was happening in Australia. It sounds like to me that Australia passed a law that allowed them to backdoor encryption. The article that I posted talked about how they said, and I quote, like, for example, we can do this with a warrant. But it was like, for example, a warrant. I'm like, hold on. What are some other examples? Like, not with a warrant? Like, that's kind of interesting language. Anyway. Joff, over to you.
Okay, I suppose I'll have to talk about this being the token Australian co-host. Well, if you can even call me that now, I am a dual national these days. But anyway, as I understand it, the new legislation doesn't actually clarify actual specifics, except for naming 3 levels of assistance in accessing encrypted data. One is a technical assistance request, which is a notice to tech companies for providing voluntary assistance to law enforcement, including removing electronic protection, providing technical information, installing software, putting information in a particular format, and facilitating access to devices or services. The other one is a technical assistance notice that requires, rather than requests, so that's taking it up a notch, companies to give assistance that are already capable of providing, that is reasonable, proportionate, practical, technically feasible, giving Australian agencies the flexibility to seek decryption of encrypted communications in circumstances where companies have, okay, I'm getting tired now. And the third one is technical capability notice, which is issued by the Attorney General requiring companies to build a new capability to decrypt communications for Australian law enforcement. Now, this third entity is where all the noise is because, as we know in the US and in many other places in the world, we've sort of gone back and forth on this particular issue. And it's been, well debated and well understood, I think, that that to provide a backdoor capability in government's hands is just plain bad idea. But that doesn't mean it doesn't resurface from time to time. It certainly resurfaced in the US. And certainly, as we've seen in Australia, it's now resurfaced in the form of an actual legal binding law that's been passed. So that's all I know.
Well, it's interesting.
Right now.
I think we like to make the assumption that when we do encrypt communications, that nobody else can decrypt them other than the person that should be able to see that data and has the keys to do so. I think it obviously defeats the whole purpose of having private communications.
Right, and then the usual arguments from us, I think, would be provided, if we were involved in such a thing, and that is that. Encryption in transit, encryption at rest is extremely valuable, important technology. protects the viability of lots of enterprise commercial business transactions worldwide every single day. And also that law enforcement, I think it's a bit of what's the right word? It's a bit of a false assumption that you need a backdoor into encryption capability, because all of us in the community well and truly know that at one end or other of the communication, the data is going to eventually be unencrypted at some point. There's going to be an opportunity in the device itself if there is a need to actually access some information. And so I think that argument gets lost somewhere along the way in some circles that don't understand it technically well enough. And I'm actually, to be honest, a little bit disappointed that Australia's gone down this path, but so be it. It exists.
And, I think a related argument to that is the concept that if we put a backdoor in the product and say only the government can get to it, okay, that sounds good, but the problem is, what if somebody hacks the government and gets through their backdoor? Either the backdoor has a flaw in it, or something leaks out, the keys that the government has, or the technique that they have for getting in. Because we know nothing very sensitive would ever leak out.
Ever leak, right? How would that happen?
Government.
Eternal blue. Eternal blue.
Right.
OPM. I mean, only the most sensitive data.
Yeah. I want my fingerprints back.
Yeah, too late for that.
I think.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think to as a citizenry anywhere to, basically offer up the keys to the government directly is, I think, a dangerous path. And I think that's what Ed is pointing out, because, stuff happens. I was going to swear, but I held back.
It does. I mean, we have a story in here about OPSEC, right? And as Ed's pointing out, sometimes it's on purpose, right? But sometimes OPSEC just fails and things get out there. Such as the addresses of all of the places where you're sending your counterfeit money, which weren't encrypted.
Whoops.
As this was the case
So,
where...
the person I'd love to hear an opinion on this actually is Troy, being another token Australian that's in the community. But Troy's very, very well respected and is living in Australia. So, as much as I love to comment on this stuff, I think Troy would have a better perspective of what local conditions actually drove it, because I don't spend an awful lot of time in Australia, of late, although I'm planning on doing so next year. But so it's I think for any of the legislation of this nature, you've got to understand the public forces that were driving it, and what was the lead up to the ultimate conclusion here. And I think Ed just said it. It sounds good when you present something like this to the public to say, as law enforcement, our hands are tied. We're having a really hard time. The bad guys are using encryption. On the surface, it sells really well. And I would have loved to have a better understanding of Australian public perception leading up to this actual legislation.
Before we jump to the next story, Paul, also, I wanted to add, I'll be really curious to see over the next, 3 to 5, maybe 10 years at most, what this does to both other countries trying to follow along with this kind of legislation, as well as how the manufacturers actually respond to this, right? So does Apple decide not to play ball? I think the reason that China has such a good hold on this inside of their own country for the same types of laws is, quite frankly, they are the means of production that are producing a lot of the electronics in the world. So they can have much more control over this because a lot of these things are built in country. Not the case for Australia. So that'll be really interesting to see how that all turns out.
Are you saying that the back doors are built in China? Hardware?
More of this. So
I'm
some
just
of the
joking.
software that's. Well, I was going to say a lot of the software that's built for the phones in China, so WeChat, for example, are effectively in the government's back pocket, right? So there's probably software-based backdoors that they've built into a lot of the blessed methods of communication, and they just lock down everything else. So.
I'll be curious to know for companies that are operating in the Australian market, which there are plenty, and Australians definitely are consumers of high-end technology, like any other Western country. But I'd be interested to know for companies that are actually involved, if they do receive a technical capability notice, and this is what I think Paul was just saying, what are they actually going to do? Are they mathematically, I don't know if anybody's ever implemented like the AES algorithm and understands it mathematically. I have. The actual mathematics of the algorithm are really, really solid. You would be, frankly, changing the algorithm itself to implement a backdoor in there. So I'd be interested to know what the technical response is going to be if a move is made to build some sort of backdoor. That it may be sold to the government entity as truly a backdoor into encryption, but it may, in technical reality, be something entirely different.
Yeah, and Jeff, I think you bring up a good point. It remind me of a briefing I did with a security. Actually, there's multiple vendors in this particular space that allow you to encrypt communications in some form. There's an entire sub-industry of file sharing and email security companies that allow users to encrypt their stuff. So if Larry needs to share a document, right, instead of using Dropbox, we use their service. And it allows administrative control over that encryption such that if I lose a key and a new one is reissued, there's a master key that has access. People way better at encryption can understand that. But obviously there are ways to do it. I think it depends on what type of encryption technology that you're using, but there's an entire category underneath security that's trying to provide this to, like, if someone leaves, I still have access to their things and have that master key. Ed?
I think this is the Clipper chip. I mean, we argued this back in 1998, 1999, right. And the arguments are actually the same. There's nothing fundamentally new in the arguments. The U.S. government wanted to have this thing called the Clipper chip that was going to be in the future of all electronic communications. And the cypherpunk community, the academic crypto community, they kind of all rose up and pushed it back. I remember those fights very well. I was just getting started out in information security at the time. I've heard no new argument on either side. Yeah. Even in the Australian situation here. It's the Clipper chip. So you can just Google Clipper chip and read all the arguments there, and they're the same that they are now.
Yep. That's exactly right.
It's interesting. I want to talk about the OPSEC mistake. There was a dark web money counterfeiter that was using cryptocurrency and encrypting everything, except the one thing that, they failed to protect was he still kept a list of mailing addresses where he sent packages containing the counterfeit banknotes. I guess it's a lesson that we should encrypt everything. Well, I mean, if you're an evil bad guy, I mean, this weighs in the favor of those, in law enforcement and the good guys. But, the lesson is you've got to encrypt everything, especially.
OPSEC is hard.
It is. It's hard for. I bet you. Bad guys end up in the press when their OPSEC is bad. I don't necessarily know that some of us, or people we know outside of criminals, right, would end up in the press where OPSEC is bad. If it's bad enough, depending on the situation, sure. But we tend to pick on the criminals, I feel like, that have poor OPSEC and make fun of them. But
they're going to get better. They're just going to throw in some blockchain and some artificial intelligence, and everything's going to be beautiful.
Machine learning.
Yeah, I can feel it.
That's not machine learning.
It's interesting. Every time I talk about, I can't help but retell the story. Every time we talk about a Linux privilege escalation vulnerability, I go back to a conversation with a very smart Frenchman who warned me that Linux has some issues with privilege escalation. This was maybe 7 years ago or so, or years ago, right? And every time I cover it, I keep thinking, man, he was right. Yep, he was definitely right. And then here we have it again. And I didn't understand what Policy Kit was. I was like, oh, what is that? But apparently, it's pre-installed on distributions like Red Hat, Debian, Ubuntu, and CentOS. Pretty heavily used. It exists due to the improper validation of permission requests for any low privilege user ID greater than the variable int max. Well, it turns out that if you set your UID higher than int max, which is 21474836647, it means that you can create a user account above that value that allow you to execute any system CTL command successfully.
As Josh was saying, classic rollover.
Classic. Yeah, it's a classic rollover attack, right? Because that value is 2 to the power of 31, which is signed integer 32-bit.
Yep.
And it rolls over, right? But wow, who would have thought it? And just to think of sitting there, you're sitting. Can you imagine the actual research here, right? You're sitting here hosing around with your Linux machine, and you're like, hey, you know what? What if I put the UID up to 2 to the power of 31? What's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
It's like, whoa! It was probably a complete accident, right? But talk about fun, right? Yeah,
Right.
this is and not enough too. I see pen testers make this mistake and forget to test integer bounds. And it's amazing the kinds of things you can find with integer bounds kind of checking. And this is certainly an example.
Yeah.
It makes me think a cool challenge would be like if you only had access to system CTL, like what you could do, how quickly could you do it? Like I think that would be speaking of challenges, right? That'd be kind of a cool challenge. Like what could you do with just this? I think it made me think about that. That's an exercise that I think many of us should probably do more regularly is limit yourself in some arbitrary way and see what you can do. To me, that sounds like a lot of fun.
It sounds like a new blog.
Right?
Like System Control Kung Fu?
Yeah.
Like kind of like that
also the
old
best-
command line Kung Fu?
Right, like how many ways to shell and other things could you find using just one command?
That would be fun. I think it's a really good time. Yeah.
And I'm sure
It's the
there's
best way to learn Linux.
right,
honestly.
and there's a lot of pen testers out there that probably are faced with this situation quite often, very limited tool set, and what can I do? So
If you look over the last 3 years of Holiday Hack Challenge, including this year, we do something just like that. We will give you a limited environment. You're kind of stuck in this very restricted shell or some other thing. Maybe you'll see something like a Python prompt this year, and go. You just have to get control of this machine. The system CTL thing is especially nice, I think.
right. Well,
Like you should be able to with that, right?
yeah. It's kind of like if you were working in a Docker container at all times. You're just naturally limited inside of a Docker container.
Hey, that's no joke. I've actually on real honest to God pen tests landed inside of a Docker container and gone, uh-oh, what do I do
What
now?
do I do now?
It's kind of like landing in this small little micro moon and going,
Yep.
Where do I go?
What do I do?
Where do I
What do I- Wait, where is System D? Crap, it's not here at all. It never is,
shit.
right?
Now what?
I hate that.
If that's like a little micro moon, then you got to terraform it,
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
How can I start growing stuff on this?
Huh. Is that another hidden ad, Terraform?
No comment.
Okay, good.
He did use the word go in his
And he did say
sentence.
Terraform.
Yeah.
Mm.
We're just making
It's the
notes.
password. It's Santa's password.
Go? Wow.
That's
sucks.
bad. Yeah, Santa's got bad OPSEC.
Santa should have learned.
Right. Ticketmaster has failed to take responsibility for malware. I
saw
we
the
could-
story from Lee, and this was
Could you
amazing.
debating this is just so I don't know. I mean, so basically the way I understand it happened is that Ticketmaster was using a third party to what was that functionality? Larry, do you remember? They're using some third party for some functionality, incorporating some JavaScript code, and the report says basically Ticketmaster incorporated this other feature or more JavaScript code from this third party without the third party's blessing, because the third party says, well, if Ticketmaster had told us they were going to do that, we would have said, no, that's insecure. People are going to hack the site.
MageCart.
MageCart.
So they're a shopping cart.
Yes. And so the debate between Ticketmaster and MageCart continues, where Ticketmaster says, well, we're using their third-party libraries and JavaScript.
It's their
and,
problem.
People hacked us through that, and it's clearly MageCart's problem. MageCart's going, well, Ticketmaster used this other functionality, incorporated this other script that we never told them that they should use ever. Or if they had asked us, we would have told them never to use it. And now people are trying to get refunds from Ticketmaster and all this stuff, and Ticketmaster's like, no, not our fault.
Not our problem.
So in this age of incorporating third-party JavaScript and such, who's liable? I feel like we could have a pretty healthy debate about this. Keith, do you care to weigh in on this as this is in your direct area of expertise?
Honestly, it is the responsibility of the people that are using the software to understand how it works. Full stop. Like, honestly, if they don't understand what they're wrapping in for their code, they shouldn't be using it. Period.
Right.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
I'd agree with that.
Yep. Full stop. No debate.
I have
So
I
much
have
for the
found-
debate.
Sorry,
I have found
I felt
the
very
same
strongly about that.
I have found the exact same issue, by the way, in mobile apps. I've actually, been involved. I won't drop any names, but I've been involved in pen testing some mobile apps and found a library dependency where the developers of the app did not understand all of the features of the library, and there was a debug mode in there that you could turn on by sending the Android app an intent. And all of a sudden, it logged all of the HTTP and HTTPS transactions to the Android debug log. So you saw all the cookies, you saw
How convenient.
It was fantastic.
How can you know all of the features of your software? I mean, if they're not documented, do you have to do a complete code analysis of every possible thing you're going to call?
Well,
Is
that's
that
a good
economically sensible?
I mean, that's what we're coming. That's what to be secure. That's what we're coming down to. And before the show, we were talking about open source software, its vulnerabilities, and software that detects open source software vulnerabilities. And now more than ever, you've really got to know your software inventory, but also, as Ed was saying, the impacts of all of it. And at what point does that just not become, as you said, Ed, economically feasible?
Yeah.
So
I think
actually,
very
to Ed's question as well. So in the medical space, right? So I work at Thermo Fisher Scientific. We make lab science and medical device technologies. One of the things that the FDA requires us to have, or is soon expected to require us to have, is a software bill of materials. They're actually expecting us to know what's in our software.
Yeah, but knowing what's in it and knowing if it's vulnerable or not are two different things.
And knowing how it works.
Conceivably. Not all the time.
Fair, but also, I mean, the FDA also goes on to say things like, hey, by the way, if you have a vulnerability in your code base, you need to inform your customers within 60 days. So it behooves us to actually know that there are vulnerabilities in our code base, right? It's
But
actually
if you don't look
regulated to require us to.
If you don't look for vulnerabilities in your code base, do you not have anything to report ever?
No, then you're just negligent. That's an entirely different problem set.
But is the term escapes me when you don't know about something.
Stupidity.
Wow. Ignorance. Is ignorance negligence?
Willful ignorance. Right. So willful ignorance, not doing your due diligence based on your software bill of materials. I would imagine the FDA would call that willful ignorance at some point.
And there's a difference between willful ignorance and actual ignorance. So.
Right. So if you have the ability to scan it, then you should scan it, right? Is kind of the way that I look at it. And that's not to say that there aren't, semi-decent or at least halfway decent tier one, like I'm talking the lowest level that you should probably be doing everywhere, scans that you could do with free open source software. Arachne is a great one for dynamic analysis, for example. So there are tools out there that you can at least get a high level start on these things that shouldn't cost you anything. So you should be doing them.
Again, my concern that I think really took shape this year was the presence of open source software components inside of your software that are vulnerable. And I think it's pretty fascinating how that's evolved into not just that, like, we know I incorporated a library and I know that it's vulnerable, or like I'm running WordPress, which in fact is vulnerable, but I'm running a vulnerable WordPress plugin because it was announced. But what happens when I'm building software, incorporating components, and as we've documented over the course of this year, the author just gives up and says, you know what, it's out there. Even if someone did report a vulnerability, it's not there. Or as is in the case with a Node plugin or Node package, the author gave up, but had previously given commit rights to someone who then built in a backdoor to mine cryptocurrency. That was one of, I hate talking about trends, right? But this was one of the topics that got me fired up this year. That I really believe we need to raise more awareness on and try to solve. And I know a lot of us on the show have talked about it at nauseum this year. Ed, I'd like to get your take on this problem, your assessment of it, and maybe some suggestions for it.
Well, it's a really hard problem because, I mean, the thing that makes software development more straightforward and more open to more people. I mean, the point is we don't have enough security people, but we don't even have enough software developers in the world to develop all the software that we need. So they're trying to make languages that make it easier for people to develop software. And how do you do that? You give them libraries, all kinds of libraries, and you make it easily so you can dynamically add libraries and functionality and capabilities to your code, and then you just call it. So the trend is to more complicated library calls to all kinds of code that nobody's really looked at, that you're either loading down across the net, doing an update now, or dynamically pulling into your environment. it is a complete mess and a disaster. And I think it's getting far, far, far worse just looking at how modern code is put together. Nobody has any idea of when they make an API call, all the other calls that get made until it like touches the hardware. No freaking clue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you? You guys develop some code, right? Do you really know? You make some calls. Maybe you know the library you call, but do you know what it calls and what it calls? You've seen your Python code crash, Joff, or maybe your code never crashes. You see that walk
Wait,
back.
hold on. You're assuming that it runs.
That? What did I call?
Yeah.
And I'm trusting all that, right? It's bewildering. I don't know the solution to the problem, but I think it's getting far, far worse based on the way modern code is developed and the fact that we're trying to isolate the developers from the complexity of what the machine underneath is doing by giving them more and more libraries to call that are less and less trusted. Oh, my office at the top of the hour always does the wongs.
That's a good reminder. Yeah, let's try and cover a couple of stories. I do have some public bug bounty stuff in there. There was an article, Bug Crowd polled its bug bounty hunters. I don't know about you guys. I couldn't find anything really compelling in that article to talk about. I mean, they talk about statistics. They talk about 31.56% of bug bounty hunters aspire to be a full-time bug bounty hunter. Okay, that's great. 72% of the hacker community are ages 18 to 29. 43% learned how to hack via online resources and blogs, and 41% are self-taught. Maybe there's something in there that many bug bounty hunters aren't formally trained, but in our field, I mean, it's much like sales. It only counts once the deal closes or once you actually find a bug. Mm-hmm. How you got there, as long as it's ethical, seemingly doesn't really matter. So I don't know. I didn't find anything particularly useful or really insightful based on this survey.
I do have young people who sometimes ask me. They'll say, maybe it's college kids, and they'll say, "Hey, what do you think about me becoming a full-time bug bounty hunter?" Mm. And I say, look, I don't know if I do that long term. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you got to feed yourself, mm-hmm. and you might starve. If it might be that you just choose an unlucky problem set to work on, and you don't get any bugs from it,
right?
Or your skills aren't quite up to snuff for the given piece of software you're looking at. So I always say that's nice to do on the side. It's almost like, hey, I want to be a musician. That's what I want to do for a living. That's great, and maybe you'll hit it big,
right?
But you might want something on the side that you could do too.
I think that's a good analogy.
And that's a really good point, Ed, as well. Having formerly worked at BugCrowd, full disclosure, a lot of the people that are able to do this full time live in areas of the world where making a few $100s for the month is your living wage, right? Like that's a livable wage. So to do that full time in a first world country like the United States or even parts of Europe, you've got to be some of the very best in the world at what you do. And as much as all of us aspire to be the very best in the world, especially when you're getting started, that's just not the case, right? So it's a good way to practice is the way that I always point it back to people. So it's a good way to stay up on your skills, to look at new things, to explore different technologies in a way that can add value to your skill set. But until you become the very best, it's not going to be a livable wage for you.
No,
That's well said, actually. And it actually brings up this interesting idea. So people in, I don't know, let's call them non-privileged countries who can, actually have a pretty good living making less money than somebody could in a first world country, they're actually finding all the mistakes that are made in code all over the world. And that's kind of a cool thing, I think, ultimately. Yeah, if the economics of third world countries allow their very smart people to find the flaws that they're using in the software and that we're using, hey, I think that makes everything better. And hopefully over time it'll drive the wages up there.
Mm.
Absolutely. And quite frankly, it's a great way to open up those markets and explore the whole idea around security testing, reliable security testing in areas of the world that has traditionally been overlooked. I think that it changes lives in a very positive way is the way that I like to look at it.
That's pretty cool. I like that.
The most, I add this for entertainment value, the worst password offenders of 2018 exposed was the title. God. I did, again, I thought it was fairly entertaining. They open up with Kanye West, his visit to the White House, and disclosing his iPhone passcode, which was highly entertaining. I thought the one that gets me is the Italian company Ferrero, who offered spectacularly bad password advice to users. They suggested the use of Nutella They say the name of a popular sweet spread as a password. Do they really feel the need to explain what Nutella is? Do most people not know what Nutella is?
Gnutella or Nutella?
Is that Gnutella or Nutella?
Wait, well, which one are you are you referring to the hazelnut spread or the peer-to-peer file sharing network?
I am referring to the hazelnut spread,
Okay,
Larry.
so Nutella.
Yes.
Why not both, Larry? Why not both? The hazelnut spread file sharing network.
Wait,
I'm onto something.
this is a business model I can get behind. Where's Tom Liston when you need him?
This was just, it was all a chuckles in this article. A White House staffer who wrote down his email login and password on official White House stationery, which is just comical. The plain text password left on a GitHub allowed anyone to access millions of people's data in from university researchers.
So what? Equifax?
I didn't get into the advice for users. However, I will say again, not to talk about trends, but one of the things this year that I think more so came to light for me were the behavioral and attribute study of how a user behaves and the attributes about their computing devices and connectivity that can tie that back to a person's identity so that you don't have to enter your password or a second factor that I think is very promising now more so than ever before to be able to authenticate people without them having to dig out a two-factor authentication token or enter their password because of the location of your devices and other attributes such as Wi-Fi networks and Bluetooth devices. I think that's pretty promising. I don't know if we'll get there anytime soon, but I think it's pretty cool.
Speaking of which, you talk about the whole two-factor. You don't have to dig out another authenticator device. I forget who I was talking with, and it just dawned on me a bunch of the things that I do two-factor for, I use Authy on my phone. And then somebody said to me, "Oh yeah, I love using Authy because they have a desktop app." I'm like, "Wait, what?"
What's Authy? Is it like a Google Authenticator?
Yeah, it's like a Google Authenticator type thing. And like they have a desktop app. I'm like, that's cool. So you put my 2FA on the same computer that I'm going to use to log in on? Wait, what?
Wait, what?
Dude, what? I don't have the desktop Authy app to know if there's any credential you need to get into it or something.
Right.
Like
a second factor for your second factor?
Dude, I heard you like second factor, so I put a second factor in your second factor.
Is it like a third factor?
I think it's more like a turd factor myself. But
sure. We'll go with that. Okay. Everyone's getting after me for going in the next segment as we're a little over time, but everyone is the hotly anticipated segment on Holiday Hack Challenge, I think is what everyone wants to get to. So we'll take a short break, come back with Ed Scotus to talk about that.